This video is brought to you by Brilliant. At first glance, it looks like Turkey's economy is finally returning to normalcy. After years of funky monetary policy, late last year, Erdogan U-turned and began raising interest rates in an attempt to finally curb Turkey's chronic inflation problem. While these rate hikes took a while to kick in the past few months, the Turkish lira, which has lost nearly 95% of its value in the past decade, finally stabilised against the US dollar, and last week the Turkish central bank's net foreign exchange reserves rose above zero for the first time since early 2020. This all comes off the back of some optimistic sounds from not just Turkey's finance ministry, but also various Western banks, who've tentatively restarted investing in Turkey. Nonetheless, even if there are notes of optimism, the most recent data suggests that Turkey's current account deficit is somehow still growing, and its inflation problem is still getting worse, not better. So in this video, we're going to take yet another look at Turkey's long-running economic crisis, why at first glance it looks like things might be getting better, and why on closer inspection, this apparent recovery looks worryingly precarious. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a quick recap. The lira began declining around 2018, but this slide accelerated rapidly after the pandemic, when inflation ticked up across the world. Usually, central banks hike interest rates to reduce inflation, but Erdogan did the opposite and cut rates, presumably because, as much of the world now knows, interest rate hikes can cause real economic pain, even if they do eventually bring down inflation. To get his way, Erdogan fired any central banker who dared to oppose him, which only made things worse. This put Erdogan in a difficult spot ahead of last year's election. The lira was declining fast, pushing inflation to politically unpalatable highs and crippling ordinary Turks' purchasing power. But Erdogan knew that the orthodox solution to this, raising rates, would be politically embarrassing and risk pushing Turkey into recession. So instead, Erdogan kept rates nice and low, but burnt through billions of foreign exchange reserves to stabilise the lira at about 20 per dollar. Once he'd won the election, Erdogan quickly U-turned, appointing Mehmet Şimşek as his finance minister and Hafiz Erkan as central bank governor. Both Şimşek and Erkan were considered safe hands. They both made it clear that they disagree with Erdogan's unorthodox monetary policies, and they both spent a lot of their careers at big Western banks. As expected, they started raising rates soon after being appointed, but this hasn't been enough to get Turkey out of its economic funk. Despite hiking rates from 8% to 50%, inflation has continued to rise, reaching a recent high of 75% year-on-year in May. This continued economic turmoil is probably one of the big reasons that Erdogan essentially lost the local elections in March, when his AKP party failed to win more than 50% of the popular vote for the first time since 2003, and the main opposition party, the CHP, made big gains in Turkey's urban areas. Another spanner was thrown in the works by Erkan's resignation just a few months after her appointment, after a Turkish newspaper reported that her parents were exerting undue influence inside the central bank. Nonetheless, Şimşek was apparently undeterred and continued to raise rates. Similarly, Turkey's central bank insisted that inflation would come down eventually, citing what they described as the lagged impact of monetary tightening, and promised to keep rates high for as long as needed. And, well, to their credit, in the last few weeks, Turkey's economy has shown tentative signs of strength. Even though inflation is still running hot, the lira has apparently stabilised somewhat, hovering at about 32 Turkish lira to the US dollar for the past few months. A stable currency might sound like the bare minimum, but this is a pretty impressive achievement when you consider that the lira has been falling against the dollar for basically the past decade, going from about 2 to the dollar in 2014 to 30 to the dollar at the beginning of the year. This is good news, both because a stable currency makes foreign investment easier, and because it should reduce inflation by decreasing, or at least stabilising, the price of imports. On top of that, this stabilisation hasn't been achieved by burning through billions of dollars of central bank reserves, like before last year's election, and the central bank's reserves have actually improved. However, this isn't as good as it sounds. For starters, reports from places like Bloomberg and the Council for Foreign Relations suggest that the lira's stabilisation has been mostly driven by speculative currency carry trades. For context, carry trades basically involve borrowing a currency with a low interest rate, then using that currency to buy a different currency with a higher interest rate, making a return that's roughly equivalent to the difference between the two rates. In this case, investors are borrowing dollars or euros and buying up liras and lira-denominated assets, especially Turkish bonds, to take advantage of the higher interest rates. This also explains why the central bank's reserves have been going up. Domestic banks are using these to fill their own reserves, which means that they don't have to borrow from the central bank as much as they once did. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with this, and it's one of the main reasons that central banks hike interest rates. Higher rates make it more attractive to hold local currency, which strengthens that currency and hopefully brings down inflation. Nonetheless, carry trades are a particularly volatile form of foreign investment, if you can even call it that, and the second something goes wrong, for example, if the lira declines or Erdogan U-turns again, then all this money will flow straight out, putting fresh pressure on the lira. This is why the most recent inflation data, which saw year-on-year inflation jump by the most it has since August, is particularly worrying. High inflation will put more pressure on the lira, increase volatility, and possibly even encourage Erdogan to try some more funky monetary policy, given that the current orthodox policy is causing significant economic pain while failing to bring down inflation. This hot money has also been used to finance Turkey's widening current account deficit. In other words, Turkey is still importing way more stuff than it exports. This is a bit of a shock because usually a depreciating currency forces a current account readjustment. After all, if your currency is declining, your imports should become more expensive, while your exports should become more competitive, which means less imports and more exports. Unfortunately for Erdogan, however, that's not what happened. Largely because Turkish exports have now been stagnant for the last few years, Turkey's current account deficit has actually widened recently. Turkey has been able to finance this deficit, i.e. afford these imports, by using the foreign currency flowing in via the carry trades. But if this dries up, then Turkey will have to rapidly cut back on imports, which will mean even more pain in the short term. Now, understanding exactly what has or is going to happen here can be a little tricky, requiring you to evaluate lots of information from different, often partial sources. It would be sensible then to begin improving your critical thinking skills so that you can keep sharp and better understand what's going on. And well, our sponsor Brilliant.org can help you do just that. Brilliant is the online learning platform that's designed specifically to teach you everything from maths, data analysis, programming, and AI from the ground up. You don't need a fancy degree or to have dedicated hundreds of hours to studying any of these. All you need is a device with an internet connection and a few spare minutes a day. And with your spare few minutes, you'll learn by actually doing, with Brilliant providing hands-on lessons that let you play around with concepts, a method that has been shown to be 6 times more effective than just watching lectures. What makes this even better is that this content is created by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, and more. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Just click on the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.